Big picture thinking requires being willing to change. We need big picture thinkers, convictional leaders, and we're talking with one today. Dr. Todd Marrah, superintendent of Tree of Life Christian Schools, next on the Clearly Christian podcast.
Welcome to the Clearly Christian podcast with Dr. Cy Smith. It's time to know more so you can say no more. It's time for the Clearly Christian podcast. Here's your host, Dr. Cy Smith.
I'm Dr. Cy Smith, and this is Clearly Christian, a podcast about what it means to see the world from God's perspective, and then the impact that this has on training the next generation to live a life consistent with the biblical worldview. If you like the show, you've been listening, I'd encourage you to hit the subscribe button or leave a review or a comment. That'll let others know that the show's worth listening to, and it'll certainly help advance the cause of Christian education. Our guest today is Dr. Todd Marrah. I'm excited to introduce him. He is the superintendent of Tree of Life Christian Schools in Columbus, Ohio. He's also president of the board at ACSI, which stands for the Association of Christian Schools International. Dr. Marrah has been an effective school leader and advocate for Christian education for well over 30 years now, and his convictions have made him a well-respected and well-known leader among his peers. So I'm certainly excited to talk to Dr. Marrah today, and I know you're going to enjoy our conversation. So we'll bring him in just shortly, but let's go ahead and set up today's episode, and let's go ahead and go to school, as we say. Today, I need you to know more about what it takes to lead well over time, and then the impact that this has on big picture thinking and passionate convictions. Again, leading well over time, big picture thinking, and passionate convictions. With this episode, I'm launching what I'm calling the Leadership Series. I want to focus on Christian leadership, primarily within education, and call attention to those leaders, Christian leaders, that have really distinguished themselves in terms of their habits, again, their competencies and their character traits over some time now in Christian education. I was hesitant to jump into this space due to the high number of podcasts and books and resources that are already out there on this topic of leadership. It certainly seems like a crowded market. Yet, like many others, I'm constantly there. I'm reading, I'm listening, I'm following along with the advice of those that have uncovered leadership truths and are sharing those well with others. And I'm constantly learning more and more every day and each year. A few months ago, my guest again and I, Todd Marrah, were invited to speak to a small group of Christian school leaders for a day of encouragement and challenge. Likely because of my lengthy tenure in this position, I was asked to speak on this topic, leading well over time. And although my guest, Dr. Marrah, was asked to speak about leading the school board well over time, he certainly could talk about this issue as well, as both of us have spent over 30 years in these positions. Suddenly, we both have become the most seasoned leaders in the room, and I know he would agree, in our circles. And these are not large circles. It's easy for us to notice how rare we have become, especially in terms of, again, the length of leadership. Short terms for leaders today are become the exception rather than the rule, especially in education. The average tenure is amazingly short and temporary, and consequently, the leadership impact on the organization is temporary as well. Leadership is an endurance test, writes Albert Mohler. Leaders face countless frustrations, you know that, complications and resistance. The burdens can be demoralizing and exhausting. The highs can be amazingly high, and the lows can be very heart-wrenching at times. It's also lonely on top. Add that to the equation. The circle of peers, as I said, was small for sure. So perhaps it's no wonder then that so few make a public commitment to stay over the long haul. But great impact, writes Mohler, requires a lengthy term of leadership, and the leaders who make the biggest difference are those with a long tenure. There's two characteristics that I think my guest and I share, and I shared that with this small group of administrators that day. And these are also going to be my chalkboard points as we open. First, leaders must constantly gauge the horizon in order to navigate change. Again, leaders must constantly gauge the horizon to navigate change. And second, the leadership that matters most is convictional, because only a passionate belief in the mission will endure over time. And let me just explain those briefly before we set it up. Given the pace and reality of change that takes place in our culture, the demand to change course when necessary is just a non-negotiable today. If you're change resistant, then this is not really the job for you. But accepting and making change is only part of the story. Accurately gauging the horizon is another step altogether. Leaders that have demonstrated competency here in terms of assessing what has happened, assessing what's happening right now, and then looking well into the future, those are the leaders that have lasted. They pay close attention to what's around them, obviously. They read, they study, they listen, they engage. They're constantly reflecting on what they're learning. The challenge of understanding and meeting the needs of today's youth culture is a good example. If you're going to understand today's youth and meet their needs, well, that's certainly going to alter how you approach spiritual formation as a school and how you foster their spiritual growth. So you've got to stay in tune with that as an example. And again, I picked that example because that's one that, again, I know my guest does very, very well. I would agree with John Maxwell in this point related to this topic. Leaders have to acquire the wisdom and the mindset of big picture thinking, and we'll explore that in today's episode because, again, I know my guest does that very well. And to my second point, we've discussed convictional leadership on this podcast before. People follow men and women who live and lead out of their convictions. They recognize that a passionate belief in the mission in something that's bigger than themselves. They recognize the behaviors of someone who knows their beliefs matter because they know they're grounded in truth. And so they're convicted to weather the storms of leadership that just come for the sake of the mission. Leaders who endure recognize that we matter because our convictions matter. And regardless of our natural tendencies, we've got to lead and we've got to make a difference. I know that's how I see the world. That's how my guest sees the world. And so that's how we want to talk, or that's what we want to talk about today. And that's how we approach these positions. So we look forward to discussing those things. Again, 2 chalkboard points that I want to mention out of the gate. Number 1, leaders must constantly gauge the horizon in order to navigate change. And chalkboard point number 2, the leadership that matters most is convictional because only a passionate belief in the mission is what's going to endure over time. So again, now you know more. When you know more, you can do more. You can not only think differently, but you can act differently, and you can say no more when you must. So with that, let me go ahead and bring in our guest, Dr. Todd Marrah. Again, it's a pleasure to have you here. Again, Todd's the superintendent of Tree of Life Christian Schools in Columbus, as I mentioned, president of the ACSI board, the Association of Christian Schools International. He's also an executive pastor at Rock City Church in Columbus, one of the fastest growing churches in America. He's been a middle school principal and teacher, a high school principal and teacher. And in the church world, he served as a children's pastor and a youth pastor, a preaching pastor, executive pastor, and he's done these things for a number of years, obviously in both education and the church setting. So this certainly gives him unique insights and a good perspective on current issues facing education and the church. He's had the privilege of consulting with a number of Christian schools and churches and frequently speaks on topics such as board governance, leadership, strategic planning, spiritual formation, and Christian parenting. Matter of fact, his research focused on spiritual formation of middle and high school students, and his dissertation initiated research on spiritual formation and Christian schooling with ACSI. So I'm certainly proud of the work that he's done, proud of our friendship all these years. We were young administrators years and years ago when we got started. I don't know if we didn't know what we didn't know, but that's okay. But we both committed ourselves to this task. We've stayed good friends ever since. And so when I thought about launching this series, he's definitely one of the first people I thought about. So I know you're going to look forward to this conversation. So thanks so much, Todd, for joining me today.
Todd, what a great privilege to be invited. I'm so proud of you for what you've done in these podcasts, and looking forward to the opportunity to do it with you. And as you've said, friendship over all these years, fellowship in Christ, as leading schools over all these years. I've needed that from you, and I'm grateful to you for it.
Thank you, brother. Appreciate that. Yep. We are quick to email or text each other and say, are you going to this conference? If so, what flight are you on? And so we've often hooked up for those things. And so, like you said, we need each other in this small circle of leadership. And I'm sure those of you listening can certainly relate to some degree. So we'll just jump right in. Tell us about your tenure at Tree of Life. I know you could talk for the rest of our time about, over 30 some years. I think it's maybe 33, 34 now, something like that. It was just incredible run. And again, proud of you as well. But significantly, you've seen so much change over the years. Maybe a few things, maybe 1, 2, 3 that really stand out to you as some of the most significant change you've seen in your tenure at Tree of Life and education. A big topic, I know, but give us a couple things to kick us off with.
Yeah, I've had the privilege of serving for 35 years now at Tree of Life. My mother started the school, and so it's a family heritage piece for me. She's still alive, and now my grandson is in the school as well. So I've had 4 generations of our family all at Tree of Life. And so the perseverance of it, as you were sharing in your introductory comments, really resonated with me. And I've loved being a part of this. What a great privilege to be a part of anything that God is doing. As for educational change, I think we'd all agree that it's not at all what we started with all these years ago. Education doesn't look like what they prepared me for when I was in college, and neither does leadership. But in a lot of ways, there are new good directions in education, things we can be excited about, new opportunities to individualize education for kids, looking well to the emotional, spiritual, academic needs of kids. I think the emotional change in students has been significant. Even in the last 5 years, that's been a radical shift for us as educators, as our cultural impact on our students is heavier and heavier, as social media is heavier and heavier. They're struggling emotionally. So we're trying to meet their academic needs, obviously trying to connect with them spiritually. And often that begins with emotional well-being.
Yeah. Good point. I'm not sure the average American or parent, or I don't know what age group here I'm referring to, maybe millennial and beyond. I bet you Gen X for sure and Boomer undoubtedly. I'm not sure they realize exactly what you just said there. The concentrated time that we are now giving to emotional health in schools. And I don't know if that was something that we necessarily, like you said, we didn't plan on this. We never talked about it when you and I were in undergrad. We never talked about it for the first 20 plus years of our educational careers. But the culture has given us this dynamic, given us this agenda, and we have had no choice. And that certainly is a good segue into what my next question was, is, do you think obviously some of those things that you just mentioned are connected to cultural shifts that we're experiencing at both home and church, since you are in those two worlds as well?
Well, Satan's effectively coming against the family, and so the family is unraveling and the culture is unraveling, and that impacts people's lives. It impacts families, it impacts students, it impacts children. We'd like to think that children are resilient and they'll all be fine, and it's just not true. They need intervention from God's people and the Holy Spirit in their lives in the day-to-day. And so we know that if we can't support their emotional well-being that they can't learn well, and it really impacts their spiritual lives as well. So that's been a huge change, and the church is observing the same thing. I'll tell you another thing that we're observing here at Tree of Life. So many of our families that are coming, and the school's grown by hundreds of students in the last couple of years, are coming from families who've met Jesus recently. And so the parents weren't raised to know Christ. They're very eager for their children to be raised to know Christ, but they don't really know how. So it's a great opportunity for the church and the school to come alongside the family and partnering with them to helping them raise their children to a deep, intellectual, but also personal, intimate relationship with Jesus Christ.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm glad you brought that up, in that they're bold enough to know that, yep, I need to do something different. I want to make a change. I'm not going to do, or I'm not going to train my children the way I was trained, perhaps, or I want to make sure they get a Christian education, but I have no idea what that looks like. And I recognize that it's important. Not really sure what the solution is, but if you can help me with this. And that's a big move, because I think in prior generations, they just kind of did whatever anybody else did. So they're brave enough to recognize that something's wrong here. It's very broken, and I don't want my child to be led down a path that is broken.
Yeah, we used to have the sense that most of our Christian school students came from healthy or whole families. And we just don't have that sense anymore because it's just not the reality of our culture. So many families are hurting and looking for a partner who loves their kids into loving Jesus 7 hours a day. That's what we get to do, right? Our teachers get to love our students into loving Jesus, teaching them to think biblically, to love passionately, to serve generously, just like they see in Jesus. What a great opportunity to come alongside the Christian home.
Yeah, for sure. In that first part of your answer, I was reminded what Stone Street says often, that ideas have consequences, bad ideas have victims. And typically the most victimized group of bad ideas throughout American history, throughout world history, is typically children. And that definitely is a significant factor in terms of what we're dealing with today. And I think you and I see it on the front lines day in and day out. And I don't know if our culture always realizes how these things that maybe take place in the adult world, and we say, oh, well, we'll do this in moderation, or this is an adult thing, or blah, blah, blah. These things always hit the kids, and they hit them hard. And boy, they just don't understand the mental and emotional and the sociological taxing that's going to take on adolescence once this makes its way down to the teenage mind or even the preteen mind. And it always does. I don't know why we can't figure that out as a society. It always gets there, and it gets there in a hurry.
Yes.
Even something simple like, vaping and things like that they just, well, it's smoking, it's vaping. And I mean, again, just a minor example, but now we're, study after study. Wow, this is really harmful for kids. Well, why are they doing it? They shouldn't be doing it. Well, of course they're doing it. They always end up, these things trickle down to them and they want to try these things, right?
Yeah, we're swimming against the culture for sure in so many ways, but what a great opportunity to show them something better and to live out something better with them and to walk alongside them as they struggle. That's what we get to do. We get to come alongside them and be a strength in the Holy Spirit to these young people. Again, what a great privilege we have. What a great calling we have.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that shift gears is only slightly in terms of what I said in the opening, this idea of gauging what's on the horizon. And like I said, that has probably been something that you and I have spent the most time talking about, or we love to talk about, is what do you think's around the corner? And you're interested in that. I'm interested in that. Is that just a part of Todd Marrah's DNA, or do you think you've kind of trained yourself to go there? In other words, how have you tried to gauge the horizon on behalf of Tree of Life and other Christian schools? Have you been intentional about that? Like I said, have you always been like that, or is that something you've really worked to do as a leader?
Yeah, it's a great question. I love that you're addressing it because I think it's a huge part of what God calls leaders to do. And what we're really doing is looking to Him to follow Him. And He's already ahead of us, right? He already knows what the future holds. He already holds it. And so all we're really trying to do is lean into Him and directionally face Him. So this, for me, long-term leadership in Christian schooling and visionary leadership is directional. And the Lord shows us the next step and our commitment to Him. And in fact, I pray this every day. My staff would laugh if they heard me saying this to you now. Lord, keep me in step with you. I don't want to run ahead of you. I don't want to lag behind you. I'm prone to wander. So Lord, keep me from wandering. Just keep me right in step with you. You're already ahead. You see clearly. You know clearly. And I'm looking to you to guide Tree of Life. It's your school. Rock City is your church. ACSI is your organization, not mine. So I'm asking that you would lead, and I know the responsibility you've given to me or us as leaders. So I'm leaning into you directionally, Father. I'm with you. Show me where you're headed. I'm coming.
So prayer, obviously, number one for you, and just knowing that to be a leader means, yeah, I have to provide the direction for this organization. So you just own that as a responsibility, because I think too many of us, and maybe that's why they don't last, they don't do anything more than just react. So things are going on, I'm reacting to those things, and hopefully I make good decisions, and that's being a leader.
Yeah, if you're the leader of the organization, you're the one who's tasked with looking over the horizon. Nobody else has it as their job. Teachers don't have it as their job. Office personnel don't have it as their job. Even some of the executive team members don't have it as their job. It's ours. We're supposed to look at the Lord and say, Lord, It's your place. Where are you leading? I'm following. So you show me and I'll show others. Just let me see what you see. And our eyes have to be fixed there. No one else's eyes are. So if it's not us, then we won't be looking over their eyes. And it has to be people like you and me leaning into what Jesus is doing. I'll give you another way that we try to focus on that here, Si, both at the church and at the school. We focus on momentum a lot. So we're a pretty strong believer that God works in momentum. So we define momentum as a series of small, successful completions, like dominoes. So we're going to start school this year. It's going to be a domino by God's grace. And then we're going to have a good start. And then we're going to do this. And we focus every week really on a series of small, successful completions headed in the same direction all the time, never stopping on momentum, constantly focusing on building momentum. And here's what we find Jesus doing in the midst of momentum. As we focus on a series of small, successful completions, we capture what he's doing. So we will send film people there to film it, or we'll tell the story, or we'll write about it. But we like to capture what we saw him successfully do in our school or our church. And then we package it. People whose job it is to put together what he just did, whether it's in a video or in a podcast or whatever way we might want to package what Jesus did. So we are working on momentum. We capture the moments where we find him. We package the moments where we find him, and then we celebrate him. And the psalmist says that God inhabits the celebrations of his people, the praises of his people. And so he is in the midst of that celebration. The whole community is excited about what God is doing in our school or in our church. We're celebrating him. We find him again. Momentum continues. Momentum continues. And the Holy Spirit seems to work in that way. And as I was first hearing about that and thinking about that, I was thinking about it biblically. Communion's a perfect example. God said, we're going to capture this moment. Jesus said, we're going to capture this. And this is my body. This is my blood. We're going to package it. As often as you do this, we're going to package it. Break the bread, drink the wine. And when you do it, celebrate me, worship me, celebrate me until I return. Communion is capture, package, celebrate. Or when they cross the Jordan River, we're going to celebrate this moment, go back into the base of the Jordan River, get 12 stones, one for each one of the 12 tribes. We're going to capture the moment. You're going to take those 12 stones out of the basin of the river. You're going to set them up as an altar to me. We're going to capture the moment. We're going to package the moment in this altar. And now we're going to celebrate. Everybody that walks by is going to say, what's this altar about? And Grandpa is going to explain to granddaughter, the Lord parted the waters here and led his people into the promised land. And he just never stopped. So we work on directionally focusing where Jesus is taking us, looking over the horizon. And every step along the way is toward that horizon, capturing, packaging, celebrating what Jesus is doing, and the momentum never stops. At least that's the idea.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And I think if more leaders would do that, because really what you're doing, it forces you to look at the big picture, because you're constantly evaluating this idea of the dominoes, like you said, and momentum. I love that idea. Because you're constantly asking your team, where are the wins? Where are the losses? Obviously, what's our momentum? It reminds me of Colin's flywheel. You're trying to push it, get momentum. And once you start getting momentum, all right, well, we're not going to stop this thing, right? But we got to notice, like what you said, notice these things, capture them, celebrate them. And when you make that a habit, which is what you're now doing, that certainly is this idea of, man, I am gauging what's on the horizon, because I'm constantly seeing this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened. This helps me understand a little bit what might happen next. I'm praying through it, but God's helping me use my wisdom, my big picture thinking, my critical thinking, because if this led to this, led to this, led to this, maybe this is what's next. Maybe this is where we need to go. You can use some strategy, right? You're not just rolling the dice and winging it, because you're paying attention to the momentum that the Holy Spirit's providing. So I love that. And I think you and I both know, unfortunately, what happens at too many schools, like I just said, is head down. I can't see the horizon because I got immediate stuff. I got today's agenda. I got to get through it till 3:00. And I'm always telling those, especially those small school guys, and I feel bad stereotyping them as small school, but unfortunately, they just don't have a lot of resources. I'm telling them all the time, you have to be intentional about the head up. You won't see the horizon like this. You've got to start working from a head down and there's moments when head down's important, right? We all have things we have to get done. But man, keep that head up because you won't notice those momentum moments that you were just talking about. Those are great examples. And man, there's just got to be some rooms for making that a part of your leadership.
Yeah, and if the last domino falls and the next one is not set up, then the momentum stops. Right. So we have to be laying the dominoes out front, and we're trusting the Lord in that, right? It's his work and it's his calling. So we're asking him, where do the dominoes go? But if we don't set them up on the future, then the last domino falls and there's no momentum left any longer. So yeah, large school, small school, somebody has to keep their eyes focused over the horizon on what Jesus is doing now and next in order to celebrate him when we get there.
Yeah, right. Are you telling boards that when you're talking to boards too?
It is hard to lift our eyes, right? The demands of the day-to-day are real. And so it's hard for us to lift our eyes. What I've been convicted of as our school's grown, and I think you're right, it's different for different size schools, but I've been able, by God's grace, to put the people around me to do the jobs that I used to do as head of school, and now they're better at them than I ever was anyway, right? So I'm surrounding myself with people who are better than I ever was, and they're doing what they do really well for our organization. And that frees me up to look over the horizon. And of course, that can't work for everyone, but somebody has to be freed up to look for the Lord and where he's taking us and then walk with him.
That's exactly right. And I think small schools can do that, but the board has to recognize that for sure. They have to be able to say, okay, listen, we may be a small school and our head of school needs to do multiple different things, and he's going to maybe have to do some things that a Todd and a ACSI would not do. But we also, in the same vein, have to recognize that if we fill his plate with immediacy, we will not have a head of school or a principal who has any capacity to look over the horizon. It's just too jammed. So, yeah, we're very blessed to have boards that trust us and think through that and give us the parameters to do that.
The boards may have to carry some of that weight, right? Either of the day-to-day or of the horizontal perspective. But there's no doubt that the head has to look at the horizon. Yeah.
And I think they would do well to remember. We could have a whole episode about this, but I think those boards would do well to remember. I'm going to have you back when we talk about board leadership. That'll definitely be here. That don't forget that those Mansfield Christian, Tree of Life, Worthington Christian, some of these other schools that we know have been, successful for a long period of time, they were once small. And so how did they get to those situations? Well, they probably had people looking on the horizon who knew that, hey, this was out there. So there once was a small school board who made some really good decisions and allowed those few good leaders back then to lead well and look on the horizon. Or like you said, maybe the board helped to do that with them. I don't know. But either way, somebody did that job well, which is why they're a big school now.
Even as we are living out our leadership right now, Tree of Life's grown by several hundred students in the last couple of years. Part of that was the pandemic. I know lots of us have experienced that. And part of that's been the cultural craziness and lots of families looking for something other than what they had. And so we've been glad to step into that space. But we are right now putting on 2 different additions to 2 different campuses, looking over the horizon and believing that Christian schooling is the answer going forward to more and more families and to more and more kids. And so we're right now creating space for what we see as future demand. And of course, it takes time to create space. It takes money. It takes time. It takes effort. But if we're going to have the space for the kids that the Lord will send us in the future, we have to be focused on what He's showing us now and stepping out in faith and saying, Lord, we believe Christian schooling is the answer. We believe it's your passion more than it's our passion. So if you want to send us more kids, we'll make more room for you sending us more kids. It's your school, you lead on.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, good. And the way you made that point is a good segue into the next question, in that it's obvious that that's a conviction of yours. And so as I was attempting to say in that opener, it's those kinds of convictions that keep us in this role. And, it's been said, leadership has an endpoint. Eventually the Marrah and Smith administrations will cease to exist. It's hard to believe because it's been 33 and 35 years, but they do have but the convictions will last. Those are what will endure. And you and I both hope that long after our names are forgotten, the conviction is the next person is just as passionate about that conviction as we are. So as you just suggested there, what are some other convictions that really that keep you saying, hey, I need to do what I'm doing at Tree of Life, ACSI, and Rock City? These are the things that really get me up in the morning and allow me to sleep well at night.
Yeah, I love that question. And because I believe this answer with all my heart, I say it as often as I can. I'm going to say it to our staff on the first day of school again this year. I think I say it to them every year. I am a strategic thinker. That's how God wired me. I am a visionary. That's how God wired me. There are good things about that and not so good things about that. Like my leadership team often says, I see, Todd, that we're going to take the hill. I get it that you want to take the hill. Do you want shoes? Do you want a sword or a spear, or are you just going to charge the hill? That's my personality. And for better or worse, it is what it is. And here's what I'm convinced about. Here's my deep conviction. One of my deepest convictions in life. I believe that Christian schooling is God's idea. I believe that Christian schooling is God's passion for discipling the next generation. I think it is the most strategic thing that we can do with our lives. I'm a strategic person. If I thought there was something more strategic to do in the kingdom of God, in the whole world, if I thought there was something more strategic to do with my life than Christian schooling, I would do that. But I don't know of anything more strategic. Who else gets 7 hours a day with kids in their best hours? Who gets them 5 days a week for as many as 15 years in a row to get to pour Jesus into them, to help them to think biblically, love passionately, serve generously? Who else gets that kind of time with the next generation? No one. Us, even parents, don't get that many quality waking hours with their kids. They sleep in their home, but in terms of 7 full hours a day focused on training up the next generation to lead for Jesus Christ, I believe what we get to do, my deep conviction is what we get to do is the most strategic thing in the kingdom to do, which is why I do it. And it's why I just pat our staff on the back. It's actually not me and you anymore, brother. It used to be, but now it's the people on the front lines, in the classrooms, in the hallways, meeting their emotional needs, meeting their spiritual needs, loving them into loving Jesus. Every single person in my staff is much more important to Tree of Life than I am, because they're much closer to students than I am. And that's why we're here, to love kids into loving Jesus.
Well said. I love that. Yep. I'm going to steal some of those lines. You know that, right?
That's good. That's good. I stole them too.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, no, I love that. And that is who you are. And you, like I said, you communicate that so well. And I think the staff will receive that well. And we had Alan Pugh on early on in this episodes, back in 23. And he mentioned exactly what you said in terms of discipling the next generation and being strategic about it. Yeah, who has a better advantage than Christian schools? And when I talk about, hey, this is the greatest hope for America, well, there's some strategy behind that, exactly like what you said, that it's not just, well, let's send them to MCS and roll the dice. No, there's a carefully laid out plan for how to train your child to think with a biblical worldview, so that your child will not just survive from Sunday to Sunday, but will have an impact on the culture for Christ and will in turn, have some sort of public sphere of influence, whether that's the workplace or government or whatever it is. But you can change the culture, but you're going to have the training to do so. And boy, you can come to Christ and you can get that training on your own. But boy, you'd be far better off if you had that training as a young person with men and women who are trained to give you that very thing that you need and then can prepare you well to lead once it's your turn.
Yeah, I'll tell you another phrase that we use out of our convictions that's pretty strong, at least around here. We think it's really important for young parents to surround their children with other qualified adults, other godly folks who are going to pour into their kids' lives. That can be at church. That can be in the neighborhood. That can certainly be in your Christian school, surrounding your kids with other qualified adults. Because, as they get older, they're going to say, well, I don't really want to know what mom and dad think, but my teacher says, or my pastor says, or that teacher said, or Dr. Smith said, or it's going to be all these other people that the Lord brought into our children's lives who will influence them. And so the scripture says a student is not above his teacher, but when he is fully trained, he will be like his teacher. And so surrounding our kids with the right teachers, and it is these teachers, they're the ones who are pouring out their lives into kids' lives every day, making a difference. And I just got back from an ACSI board meeting this last week, and we got to hear from our international global leaders. And this is happening all over the world. There are tens of thousands of Christian schools all over the world. And there are millions of kids being discipled every day by incredible faculty and staff pouring their lives into the next generation. I can't think of what matters more than that. All these incredible people discipling the next generation all over the world.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, you brought it up. Tell us a little bit about your role at ACSI. What do you do there as a board president? And maybe for the listener who might be experiencing this for the first time, what does ACSI do, or what are you noticing nationally with ACSI?
Yeah, so the Association of Christian Schools International is the largest Christian school leadership organization in the world. And I think it's because they wanted one normal person on the board for reasons I've never figured out. Some years ago, maybe 7 years ago, they asked me to join the board. What a great privilege and opportunity to hear what God is doing all over the world and to be a part of it. And everyone else around that table is amazing. So I just sit and listen and learn and steal ideas from them. They're incredible leaders in their own right, literally from all over the world. And it's my privilege for the last year to get to be the chair of the board, which again is mind-blowing. But what's really mind-blowing about it is to hear the stories of what Jesus is doing. Like, there are brothers and sisters of ours across the world who are meeting in schools unlawfully. And if they get caught, they can be killed or certainly at least imprisoned. That's happening all over the world, and they're doing it. I got to meet in Rwanda a couple of years ago on a trip that we took to Rwanda, a woman who started a Christian school that's now in 2 new campuses that are beautiful. She started a Christian school out of the trunk of her car under a tree in Rwanda. And so we went as the honored guest, but right away we're like, no, we're not the honored guest. You're the one doing the important thing. You started out with a group of kids who live in poverty, and now every day they're being educated. And that's literally happening all over the world. So to get to be any part of anything God is doing is amazing. But to get to be in Christian schooling is particularly a calling and a gift to those of us who have that calling, for sure.
Yeah, and boy, that gives new meaning to this whole idea of convictional leadership, right? Because you're doing that. If you're doing that, then like you said, risking everything for this particular mission. Now that's conviction. It's one thing for you and I to say it, especially in our own circles where we know it's pretty safe. And we get brave and we do it sometimes on public stages and things like that, although it can be a little intimidating at times, that's for sure. It's another thing to do it in another country where you know that, I'm not only going to get persecuted, I could have my life threatened. I could, my family's life could be threatened or something like that. I'm so convicted that this is, as you said, what God intends for his children, God's plan for humanity. I'm going to go ahead and step out and really do. Now that's conviction.
Yes, indeed. Last week we saw a picture of a 2nd grade classroom in China. We saw the before pictures where the 12 2nd graders were meeting, and then they heard that the government was coming because they heard they were having a Christian school in the basement of a factory. And so the 2nd graders, in 30 minutes, the 2nd graders packed up the room and cleared out. That is their norm. Like, our 2nd graders are learning to read and enjoying that and all those kinds of things. throughout the world, people are so passionate about Christian schooling. Their second graders are learning to pack up a room and be gone in 30 minutes so that they can find another place where they can learn more and more about Jesus in a Christian school. So, I mean, this matters. What we get to do matters. What God is doing all over the world matters. That's a deep conviction for us, of course, but we are a very, very small part of a massive movement of the Lord to disciple the next generation to love and walk with Jesus.
Yeah. And it's great, again, that you're in that role because, again, that's just a good example of big picture thinking. And now you're able to posit Tree of Life in that bigger picture of, like you said, what God's doing around the world. And that's just going to be beneficial for, obviously, Tree and your sphere of influence, where you're able to speak to that now and say, okay, let me show you a little glimpse of what God sees on a regular basis and in his movement, so we can step out of maybe our little Tree of Life box or our little circle, or, as that box gets smaller, our third grade classroom that, Lord bless them, there's a wonderful thing going on there, but boy, there's a lot bigger picture that you want to see. And sometimes that's hard to see when you're just trying to make it to the bell.
Yeah, you're right. But it is important for us to lift our eyes, right? The whole point of this podcast, I think, is living out of our deep convictions, but lifting our eyes to see what the Lord is doing now and over the horizon has to be one of those convictions.
Exactly. What do you think's coming behind us? So, I'm a little concerned. You and I have talked about it briefly. The next generation of leaders that are coming up behind us when you and I pass the baton here, are they going to share the same passion for these convictions, or what are you seeing? Or you have some hope for the future? Or are you a little worried that the next group behind us isn't as quite as convicted as we have been?
It does seem like there are fewer who are interested in this same passion in the younger generations. I don't know that it's on them or if it's on us. I wonder if we just haven't done well in our generation of raising up the generation behind us. Maybe even telling them the incredible stories of God at work in Christian schools. Maybe we haven't been as effective in that as we should have been. I do look within our own school and, of course, without, for who are the next generation of people who will take over leadership, who have the convictions, who has the courage, right? Who has a thick skin, right? Who's ready to tell the story of God being at work? I will say to anybody who's a young person in Christian schooling listening, the joys of this work far exceed the hassles of this work. Like, you get a front row seat to watch Jesus in the day-to-day. And I'm not saying it's all easy or it's all smooth. That would not be true. But you do get a front row seat to watch Jesus change young people's lives. And that is an incredible way to spend your own life.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I certainly hope that is the case. And like you, I'm not sure where to lay that at. I certainly see fewer. I think there's a good dynamic there that is natural. I listened to a Craig Groeschel podcast recently, and we talked about it even as a leadership team, where he talked about, first generation business owners tend to be the owners, right? And they started it, the blood, sweat, and the tears. They got to get this thing off the ground. They really, nobody's more committed to them. They didn't even take a salary, right, to make this thing work. Then after that, next generation of the protectors, and they'll protect that mission. And in many ways, Christian school, our history is kind of run like this, and you and I find ourselves in that protecting. We didn't necessarily found the school, right? Your mom founded the school, but we are now protecting that mission, and we're doing so with tremendous passion. But for most businesses, then that third generation, the inheritors, all this has been passed down to most generations most businesses, he said, never survive the third generation, because the inheritors just don't see themselves the way owners do. And they don't protect the mission the way that next generation did. So they usually squander it. And that's usually where most businesses fail. It's a business fact by the third generation. So obviously I'm thinking all this and saying that cannot happen, in Christian schools. And so we have to make sure that we are, as protectors, perhaps, if that's a good analogy, communicating that same passion and and that's what I told our team, we have to have you as inheritors. You have to have an owner mentality. not just a protector mentality. You have to revert to owners. So you're going to have to really own this mission for it to survive into that fourth and fifth generation. Because in some ways we are, and some schools are already there, of course. But if you were started in the 60s and 70s like we were, you're probably at that cusp of passing it on from 2 to 3. You might be there already, but because the people like you and me are so few and far between. But you're probably there, and they're going to have to learn to see that as an owner, and we're going to have to train them in that regard.
I will say one really encouraging thing that I get to see in my own experience at Rock City, very young church, many new people coming to Christ, thousands of new people coming to Christ. The average age, I think, is somewhere around 27. And these people are passionately in love with Jesus. The people, I'm the old guy, right? I'm way older than the average staff member at Rock City. And I love that because I'm getting to watch the next generation step into spiritual leadership in many aspects of ministry. And so I do have hope. I do think there's a great wave of leadership coming. I think we have to do a better job of handing them things and giving them experience and giving them opportunities. They're looking for that, I think, in many ways. And so for us to do that well will be essential and important, as you've said, so that they can own what they're supposed to own in their own calling. But I am encouraged. I think there are lots of young people newly meeting Christ, but passionately meeting Christ. Their lives have been changed. They're digging in, they're diving in, and they're looking to see what he's calling them to do next as well. So certainly my hope is in Christ, of course, but I'm watching him do it with the young generation by a lot of people.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Well, let's step back and look at the big picture as we close then. As you see, for those of us that are convicted that Christian education is the best hope for America. And when you think about these national education issues, what do you think's on the horizon? What are some things that maybe Christians should be watching out for? Or maybe even a better way to say it, Christian leaders should be watching out for? What are some of the issues that maybe jump off the page for you? I mean, is it more down that gender road, or is it, more social or emotional health type issues? What's right around the corner for us? Is it more school choice? I don't know. What's out there?
Yeah, it's good. I do think there are real threats for us, of course, and we should be paying attention to the threats. I'm more inclined to look at the opportunities and think that there are real opportunities on the horizon as well. I'm pretty sure that you and I, people like you and me and others, should actually be asking the Lord to help us to start more campuses. We need more opportunities for kids to get out of the failed schools that they're in, out of the secular schools that they're in. I know you guys at Mansfield have done a great job of partnering with homeschools. I think more and more we need to focus on those kind of partnerships and relationships. We should be encouraging area churches. Hey, you have enough space in your church building for 3 classrooms. Why don't we start a school there? It can be one of our campuses, or it doesn't have to be one of our campuses. It doesn't have to have my name on it, as long as it has Jesus' names on it. Who really cares about what it's named except for Christ? I think we need to open more and more opportunities for kids to be loved into loving Jesus every day and to be discipled into Christ. And there are lots of rural areas where there really isn't an opportunity for Christian schooling. And there are lots of urban kids who don't have an opportunity for Christian schooling. So as I look over the horizon, I'm excited about the church increasingly having a passion for Christian schooling. And I just want to nurture that. And I think people like me and you might get an opportunity to do that just with our life experience and our leadership experience. We should be nudging people around us, looking for opportunities around us to having more and more kids having access to Christian schooling. And we can do that through things like vouchers and things like that too. Certainly legislative awareness and activity is important. But really it's the church saying this building sits empty 5 or 6 days a week and we have space. Let's go serve kids all week long, all day long. And we might get the opportunity, I think, in the future to nurture that and nurture that and nurture that. More and more kids every day learning about Jesus all day.
Yeah, agreed. Totally. Great point. Because that is certainly a dynamic, I think, that's come full circle. This idea of the opportunities now to connect with the church and the church all of a sudden becoming passionate about Christian education. I just don't think that the bulk of our career, that has not been the case. I think we were Christian ed students maybe when that was the case, because those churches founded a lot of these schools. And so we got to benefit from that, and we jumped right on board. But then there was bulk of our history, I don't know, decades, where those churches stepped back. And a lot of pastors, even sponsoring churches, stepped back and said, I'm a little afraid to preach Christian education from the pulpit. Or there was financial struggles between the two organizations. I mean, you and I have heard the gamut of stories that those strained relationships that have hurt. But now we're coming back around to the point where I think that the churches are looking and agreeing with us and saying, hey, I not only see this and agree with it, I'm willing to speak this from the stage and say, yep, I think you're right. Christian education is the best hope for this country. And we could maybe be a player here by either starting a Christian school or hosting a Christian school or joining forces with this organization because if we're not, then as believers, we are really not going to have an impact on the culture. And everybody wants to see things turn around so desperately.
Yeah, it's that three-stranded cord, right? In Ecclesiastes, a three-stranded cord will not be easily broken. So everyone has to think this through. I say this to pastors a lot. You have the church as one cord. We all agree. We're all trusting that the home will be a second cord. What's the third cord? Because it's not the two-stranded cord that's strong. The scripture says it's the three-stranded cord. So pastors asking themselves, what's my third strand? Homes asking themselves, well, yes, I have them in the church, but what's my third strand that's going to bring that kind of strength into my child's life? And I think the natural answer is Christian schooling. I honestly think it's God's answer, that the third strand, that if we can have the child in a Christian home, the child in a Christian church, and the child in a Christian school, that's 95% of their day. And almost all their lives. And so those three-stranded cords working together as strength in a child's life, I think it's unarguable, and I think it's the right direction. And I think you're right. More and more pastors are thinking, yeah, that's probably the right third strand. How do we do it? So people like you and I have to courageously stand in and say, I'll help. I don't really know what you need, but the answer is yes. If I can send you curriculum, if I can send you our handbook, whatever you need, it's yours. Let's go get more kids. Let's go get them.
Fantastic. Well, I know that the listeners and the audience have seen and heard exactly what I hope that you would deliver as a guest today. So thank you so much for that. The passionate convictions, the big picture thinking, and what it takes to really lead well over time. And this has been a great conversation that I know that you and I could just go on and on about. So this will not be the last, and you got to promise you'll come back for round two. So this will be a great continuing on. Yeah, and it won't be when we were celebrating retirement parties or anything like that.
Well, thanks for the opportunity, Si. I really appreciate your ministry in this podcast, and I'll gladly be a part of it anytime I can, for sure.
Well, thank you for what you do and your leadership on behalf of all of us that have given our lives to this as well. It's what gets me up in the morning. Obviously, that's why I'm doing this. Just one more venue to try to get this out there and just trying to dabble in these kinds of ways to say, how else can we have a bigger sphere of influence, and maybe this will reach. So that's why, what's even behind this for me, we'll see, because I'm trying to reach a bigger audience with the exact same thing that you are. So I love that we're on the same page and been able to stay connected. So if the audience wants to stay connected with you, how should they find out more information, either about yourself, your own background, or, hey, I just want to talk to him about an issue he said, or maybe I'm a church person listening today and I want to talk to him about Rock City, or I want to talk to him about, how do we marry the church with Christian education, or Tree of Life, or ACSI, basic contact info.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'd love to have those conversations. You can find out more about ACSI probably on our website, acsi.org. Tree of Life has its own website, of course, or rockcitychurch.tv is that website. My email, I'd be glad to have an email conversation with anyone, Todd, Marrah, Marrah, at TOLCS, Tree of Life Christian Schools, TOLCS.org. So anybody that want to have a conversation about what God is doing and what he might be calling them to do, or sowing into what things are next in their lives, I'd love to have a conversation.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again for joining me. And thank you to each of you who are listening or watching online. We certainly appreciate you. And I trust that now you know more about what it takes to lead well over time, the importance of and the impact of big picture thinking and leading with passionate convictions. I know there was a lot to digest in today's episode, so I'd encourage you to rewatch or re-listen and really grab hold and reflect on some of the things that you heard Dr. Marrah say today. Again, if you'd like what you're listening to, I encourage you to hit the subscribe button, leave a review, help us spread the word. We definitely want to get this out there that the show is worth paying attention to so that we can advance the cause of Christian education. Because remember, the only way we're going to turn things around in this country is to simply increase the number of people who live and operate every day with a biblical worldview and see things from God's perspective. And the greatest hope to get there is Christian education. So thank you again for joining us today on behalf of Dr. Marrah. I'm again Dr. Si Smith with the Clearly Christian Education Podcast. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Clearly Christian Podcast with Dr. Si Smith. Hear more episodes at clearlychristianeducation.com. If you'd like more information about Christian education in your neighborhood, or if you're interested in education opportunities at Mansfield Christian School, or if you agree with Dr. Smith and want to help him in his mission to influence and awaken Christian America, you can send Dr. Smith an email through the clearlychristianeducation.com website. Message him on the Clearly Christian LinkedIn or Facebook page, or call the Clearly Christian Connection line at 419-756-5651. This has been the Clearly Christian Podcast with Dr. Si Smith on clearlychristianeducation.com, brought to you in conjunction with Mansfield Christian School, a Bryan Media production.